Thank you for that nice introduction. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I think this is one of those subjects that we all have an interest in. We all connect with the subject of mortality, the subject even of immortality. We're talking about deep, deep mysteries here. I'll tell you, since writing this book, Long for This World, I've been hanging around with neuroscientists. And as we all know, neuroscientists are baffled when they try to explain the origin of consciousness. The origins of aging, in some sense, are even deeper and more difficult than the origins of consciousness. With consciousness, at least the neuroscientists have the ability to focus on a zone somewhere above the neck. But where is it? Where is it exactly that what is aging, and what is happening, and how does aging come to be? These are profoundly interesting questions. The evolution of aging is one of the few really, really clear and powerful answers that have emerged from the field. And I want to talk about that just a little bit tonight, and I think you'll be hearing more about it tomorrow. So I just wanted to start with this wonderful quotation from Ralph Waldo Emerson. I've noticed that whenever writers approach this question, they begin to quote. I hate quotation. Tell me what you know. Well, here we are in this wonderful library, and it seems only right, in spite of Ralph Waldo Emerson, to begin with a few quotations. So let's start with Sir Francis Bacon. Back in the time of Shakespeare, in fact, Bacon is sometimes, conspiracy theorists like to say, Bacon may have written Shakespeare's plays. They don't have too much evidence for that, other than maybe a slight resemblance in the portraits and a few other things. But Bacon, as you probably know, was one of the great visionaries toward the very beginning of what we now think of as the scientific revolution. In the early 1600s in England, while Shakespeare was writing his plays, Bacon wrote The Advancement of Learning and other great works that looked ahead to the power of the scientific method. And one of the books that he wrote toward the end of his life was this, The History of Life and Death with Observations, Natural and Experimental, or The Prolonging of Life, written by the Right Honorable Francis Lord Verulam, and then a few more titles strung along there. Bacon's a fascinating character. When I was working on my book, I got so drawn into the study of Sir Francis Bacon, my editor used to have lunches with me and say, Jonathan, do you know how many pages you've written about Bacon in the latest draft? 30 pages, you have to cut it down, you have to, finally I did cut it down to maybe 2 or 3, but with pain, because he was a fascinating character, obsessed with this question of immortality and the indefinite prolongation of life. And alas, he was a theorist. The one experiment that he tried it came to him in the middle of a cold London winter that perhaps if he put a chicken in snow, packed a chicken in snow, it would preserve the flesh of the chicken. He was thinking ahead to refrigeration. He got out of his stagecoach and tried the experiment, and according to contemporary accounts, unfortunately, the chill got him, and he died soon afterward. The hen, however, was somewhat preserved. So Bacon said, those things are held possible which may be done in the succession of ages, though not within the hourglass of one man's life. And he had absolute faith that by right around now, we would be arriving at a profound enough understanding of aging and mortality that we might prolong our lives indefinitely. His favorite secretary, somebody recognized Thomas Hobbes, who coined this wonderful quotation, said he had, if anything, a greater fear of death than his boss, Lord Bacon. He once said that his mother had given birth to twins, himself and fear. And in this quotation, if you think about it, he is implying that the greatest gift of the Enlightenment, the greatest gift of the advance of science, the single greatest accomplishment civilization could offer us would be the extension of life. All the weight of that quotation, talking about primitive life before the beginnings of civilization, as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. All of it, all the weight of it and the horror of it is in that last dreadful word. And Hobbes was convinced, too, that we would eventually be able to dramatically extend human life. So was René Descartes, who believed after giving up philosophy in his 40s, the story goes that when he started to turn gray, he saw his first gray hairs, and he decided, enough with philosophy, I'm going to figure out how to live forever. And many of his acolytes had confidence that he would, in fact, live forever. And if he hadn't caught a cold toward the end of, well, if he hadn't caught a cold, he would have made it to 500 years. But alas, the cold got him. And Benjamin Franklin was another who had visions of science advancing to the point that it would be possible to dramatically extend human life. He wrote a letter to Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, in 1780, saying, "We may learn to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport." Check, right? Agriculture may diminish its labor and double its produce. Check. All diseases may by sure means be prevented or cured, not excepting even that of old age, and our lives lengthened at pleasure even beyond the antediluvian standard, meaning Methuselah or Noah or the other miraculously long-lived characters in the Bible. And there, we can't say check. But Benjamin Franklin saw that and came back to it a number of times in his correspondence as one of the great dreams of the future. Now, what is it that we are talking about when we talk about aging? How did aging evolve? This is a question that Darwin himself did not think about. And that's surprising because Darwin wrote a magnificent shelf of books. He was one of the most prolific of those prolific Victorian geniuses. And he explored his core idea, evolution by natural selection, in virtually every direction imaginable. So that evolutionary biologists to this day are not only awed but frustrated because Darwin was there first, again and again and again, foreseeing this implication and that direction and the opening up of this field, but he never seems to have thought about the evolution of aging itself. One of his greatest defenders, a decade or two later, was a great German naturalist named August Weismann, who did think about it. And Weismann argued that there is a very simple evolutionary explanation for aging. And I would bet that if you thought about it now, maybe you already have thought about it, you would subscribe to the argument that Weissman put forward. So, I mean, we could pause and take a poll, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you, and maybe if it strikes a chord with you, you could raise your hand. So, I haven't told you yet. That's one of our speakers tomorrow, Gregory Benford, who's heard Weissman's theory, I am sure. So, Weissman argued that it's adaptive for us to get old and die. It's adaptive. It's one of the great inventions, so to speak, of life on Earth, that as single cells came together to form multicellular organisms, ourselves included, they invented aging and death. That single cells, he hypothesized, are immortal, that the first life on Earth knew no death because it was so simple, it was virtually indestructible. The amoeba, the paramecium. I think I have a picture, the amoeba, the paramecium. So they never aged, they never died. But when multicellular life came along, it was just complicated enough to invent aging and death. Why? Because as we get older and more infirm, we get in the way of the young, of the next generation. And therefore, we must die to make room for the next generation coming up. That was Weissman's argument. And he went further in one of his lectures on this subject, and he said, let us imagine that one of the higher animals became immortal. What would happen then? And his thought experiment ran like this. The immortals would gradually crowd out the young until the species, I think he may have said, went extinct. It would be maladaptive in the extreme to have immortals around. That was his argument. And that, all right, I forgot, the show of hands. How many people find that a plausible explanation? Quite a few, right? It does make a certain gut sense. And I think the reason it makes some intuitive sense to us is that as things are now, we do, after a certain point in our lives, maybe when more than one gray hair has appeared upon our heads, we do feel a sense that of joy and also of obligation to make room for the next generation coming up. So it makes a certain emotional sense. But many decades passed before a very sharp-eyed biologist looked again at Weissman's argument and found it was, in his view, full of holes. And that was this gentleman, Peter Medawar, who was a caustically bright guy. He said about a theosophist, I do not propose to criticize the fatuous argument I have just outlined. Here to expound is to expose. So he tore into fools gladly. That was one of his satisfactions in life. And he tore into Weissman. And what he argued was that Weissman was assuming what he had set out to explain. That Weissman was saying that as we get old, we get frail, and therefore we need to get out of the way of the young coming up. But the question he was trying to answer is, why do we get frail as we get older? So he was assuming what he was trying to explain. That's what Medawar said. And so Medawar thought about it some more and came up with an argument that stands to this day as a much more solid and plausible way of explaining the evolution of aging. And that is this. If you think of the implications of Darwin's theory in The Origin of Species. If you think of specifically the famous chapter on the struggle for existence, which begins this way: "Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear the conclusion in mind." It's tough out there. It is tough to be a wild thing out in the world. If you are a wild mouse just outside this building trying to get along, you are probably not going to live even for a year, because it is so hard to survive in the wild. A mouse in a lab, well taken care of, cosseted in a cage, well fed, might live 3 years, might live more, but out in the wild, they generally go pretty fast, pretty young. And that is true for almost all wild things. And that was true even for our own wild ancestors if you go back far enough in evolutionary time. In the time of the caves, you were pretty lucky to make it into your 20s. There was enormous infant mortality, as there continued to be even in the days of Darwin and Weismann, and enormous mortality after that. And that, in fact, is the power of evolution by natural selection. The selection is pretty intense. I mean, not many of any generation are making it through to reproduce. So, as a result, if you mature faster than the ones around you, and get to puberty, get to reproductive age, pass on your genes, then you are better off than many, many, many others in your generation. If you, on the other hand, build very slowly and carefully a body that might last for years and years and years, take that wild mouse, build a wild mouse body that could last for 50 years, what's the point? You're probably going to get gobbled up by that owl or freeze in the winter snow long before you've reached the age of 2. So there's no point to building to last. And there is enormous selective pressure, evolutionary pressure, to build sort of a quick and dirty body that grows fast and passes on its genes within the constraint of your species' body plan and strategy in life. Some mature more slowly than others, but all of them, all life, has this same constraint of getting there fast to pass on the genes, which has the nasty implication that once you've passed that point of passing on your genes, you are sort of out of sight when it comes to evolution by natural selection. Evolution by natural selection can only work on a large population. It doesn't really help that one rare mouse that made it in the wild to the age of 2 or the age of 3. It's operating on the young. And so we are, as one biologist recently put it, disposable. We are junk after a certain age. That's the implication of this argument of metawars. There may be an exception to the argument for us, for the human species, which is of some consolation, and that's called the grandmother hypothesis. The human species has enough going on, enough of culture and civilization, enough of just home remedies and common sense and wisdom to pass on to the next generation, that maybe we are still of value, even of adaptive value, survival value, as we become the age of grandparents. And so maybe we are exceptions to that general rule. But that's where aging and death come into the world. They come into the world because it is virtually impossible for evolution by natural selection to build toward immortality. It builds us mortal. So the topic we're talking about this weekend is much on our minds, partly because I think we are all aware that we are living longer than the generation before us on the average, and living longer than the generation before that. This is one of many graphs that you'll see in the field showing life expectancy rising over the 20th century. In the year 1900, life expectancy for a baby born in the United States was under 50. By the end of the 20th century, it was pushing into the late 70s, and I guess now we're at about 80 in this country. So that's a huge change from, say, 49 to now about 80. And it makes us very conscious as mortals of possibilities. It rekindles in some ways the hopes of those founders of the scientific method and the scientific revolution, that we might continue to progress the way we've been progressing. And arguments about this are a little bit like arguments about Moore's Law. You know, maybe you've been hearing debates about Moore's Law right now, arguing, can it continue? Can we continue at the rate we've been going to continue to reduce the size of silicon chips and increase the computing power at this fantastic rate? It looks like Moore's Law is going to have to slow down unless there's some incredible technological breakthrough. The smart money in the study of demography, the study of populations, the study of life expectancy, is that we're in a position somewhat like that with Moore's Law. Unless some extraordinary breakthrough comes to some great mind somewhere, we can't keep progressing like this, the way we have been through the 20th century. So, what then? It's important to recognize that what we're talking about with increases in life expectancy is not the same as increases in lifespan. There have always been, all through history, even deep into ancient history, there have always been lucky individuals who lived a long time. Ramses II, who was the model for Ozymandias. Anybody know Shelley's poem, Ozymandias, about the vanity of human wishes and the vanity of dreams of immortality? Ramses II made it to about 90. And people study the mummy of Ramses II, and it's been suggested maybe it was a nasty infected hole in a tooth that finally got him. King David in the Psalms, actually this is Psalm 90. I don't think David wrote this one, but in the Psalms, in Hebrew scripture, there's this famous line, "The days of our years are 80 years and 10, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away." So he's talking about lifespan, human lifespan, pretty much the same way we would talk about it now. in biblical times. And I love this guy, Lawrence Chatterton, Clare College, Cambridge. At the time that Bacon was writing his history of life and death, natural history of life and death, Chatterton was on the great committee that translated the Hebrew and the Greek and created the King James Bible. And Lawrence Chatterton lived past the age of 100. So again and again, as science advances, this old dream of immortality rekindles in us because it is so deep in us. It is so deep in us. And it's fascinating to look back at history, as we're doing now, in prelude to hearing about the current cutting-edge science, as we will tomorrow, to look back and to try to learn a little bit and get a little bit of perspective. This guy, Henry, oh God, his, this is age, folks. What is his last name? Henry Widgley, something like that. He isn't that much remembered now, but in his day, in the in Victorian times, at Trinity College, Cambridge, he was one of the great philosophers, one of the most eminent moral philosophers of his time, still well respected for his work in that area. Also, he was a profound student of spiritualism and attended seance after seance, hoping that he could find evidence for the immortality of the soul. And alas, as he reached his last years, he had to admit that he hadn't found it, and he had to believe that, in fact, that hope of immortality was closed to him. What he didn't know was that his friends would continue to go to seances after his death, and they received messages from him for the rest of their lives. And they wrote them down, and there are actually volumes, posthumous volumes by this guy, all speaking through mediums to his students and his friends. So, I'm sorry?
His immortality went on.
His immortality went on. So, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was one of those people who was scribbling down those messages from. And so was Alfred Wallace, who was the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection, to Darwin's dismay. Darwin couldn't believe that Wallace would become a spiritualist, but he did. So tomorrow we're going to be exploring in many directions the science of aging and the future of medicine and the present of medicine. We're going to be hearing from Evan Snyder, who is one of the world authorities on stem cells. We're going to be hearing from Stephen Badilak, who is one of the great experts on regenerative medicine, which involves stem cells and involves efforts to train the body's cells to regenerate the way a starfish can regenerate an arm. Dr. Badilak will talk about regenerating fingers on a hand. And we'll hear from Gregory Benford about the evolution of aging in Drosophila and what we can learn from driving evolution toward Methuselah mutants with Drosophila. I first got interested in this subject because I was hanging around in the lab of a great biologist named Seymour Benzer, who worked with Drosophila and found a mutant called Methuselah. And that helped to give this entire field energy and brought many respectable scientists into what seemed like a flaky kind of flaky territory, the effort to extend life dramatically. Methuselah lived, I think it might be 40 days longer than your average fruit fly. So very exciting. And Benzer found it at the age of 77, so it had a special sentimental significance for Seymour. Now, I want to say just a word about one of the characters in the study of aging today, because when I looked around for a way to present the fascinating contradictions and complexities and paradoxes of being mortal, to find one character, so to speak, to hang a book on and explore all of that, I chose this guy here. You may see a slight family resemblance, right? He actually went to Trinity College also, like Henry what's-his-name a century before. And he once told me that this beard of his, he said, "Jonathan, I find it useful to look unusual." And this beard is sort of a badge of office. He looks a little bit like a Methuselah, and he comes on a little bit like a Methuselah, and he argues that we have some chance of living 1,000 years or 10,000 years or more. He exasperates many people in the field, understandably, but as a writer, I was drawn to try to paint his portrait and to bring out the complexities that I think we all have to some degree there's hope, there's denial, there's realism, all sort of fighting in us all the time when we think about our own mortality. And Aubrey undercuts his case somewhat by preferring to argue for the case for immortality in pubs where he drinks pretty much from morning till night. And he doesn't, he makes no bones about that. He'll tell you himself that he really likes his beer, and also that it has nothing to do with his health, and that he has, I think he's in denial in that respect. But there is so much of all of us in that kind of contradictory nature. He has wonderful insights into the science. Scientists in the field also find many things to disagree with him about. He organizes meetings to which many solid scientists go, people who don't believe that we have a shot at immortality. And I have to say, he makes a wonderful story. So I just want to close by reading you my first moments of meeting Aubrey de Grey. And I want to emphasize that I didn't write the book to promote Aubrey de Grey or to promote his argument that we might live for 10,000 years. And in fact, I was very careful in structuring the book to begin in chapter 1 arguing with Aubrey in one of his favorite pubs in Cambridge, and to end the book arguing with Aubrey in one of his favorite pubs in Cambridge. And throughout, to use him, if I could, as a literary character, might be drawn to explore the complexities, as I say, of human nature. So when I met Aubrey, he wasn't yet famous. He's become quite famous, partly because of this claim of immortality, partly perhaps because of the spectacular beard. And he was passing through the United States to give a lecture in 2002, and I invited him to stop by for a day or two to explain what he was about. I'm reading now. It was our first meeting. I picked him up at the airport in Philadelphia, and as he huddled in the death seat of my car, enduring the curves of our country roads, we were winding our way toward my house in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I lived at the time. The poor man's face looked pale to the roots of his hair and beard, corpse gray in the cheeks. His head tilted toward the window as if toward martyrdom. He'd never learned to drive, he told me when I asked him if he was all right. He couldn't help feeling frightened in cars. That's how everyone will feel, he said, when they realize that they may have hundreds or even thousands of years ahead of them. Once that truth sinks in, it will be hard to find anyone on earth who is willing to ride in an automobile, much less a police car or a fire truck. Too much life ahead, too much time to lose. Okay, thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, if you raise your hand, I'll come by with the microphone. If you have questions, we'll get it. We're videotaping. Yes, sir. We'll start up here and come back.
How old is he?
He is 10 years younger than I am, so he is now 51, going on 52. I wondered sometimes whether that 10 years made any difference in our view of things. A page or two after that scene I just read, Aubrey arrives at my house and starts proselytizing to my kids, who were then young teenagers. And I have to say, his spiel went over great with young teenage boys. They just looked at him. He was saying, "We can live forever," and they were just nodding like, finally, an adult who knows.
It has been speculated that some animals besides humans can use the grandmother thing for beyond procreations. Other primates and perhaps some other animals where they can help the young live beyond what they might otherwise.
No, that's interesting. I hadn't
And
heard
I
that.
think it's been shown maybe with gorillas and some other primates. Beyond procreation, they can keep the young from rising to the level of procreation.
That's lovely. It's a theory you just really hope is true. It's really nice.
Any other questions?
I've answered all your questions
Paula?
about mortality.
You were talking about, I think, the adaptive value, and humans might be still useful as we age to pass on information. But why wouldn't that apply to like elephants or gorillas or those that, because you hear over and over that if the mother who is got the baby has been trained herself or been a good mother, she passes on the genes. So it seems like it's the same idea in the animal world.
Yeah, we were just hearing from someone who says that that's been suggested for certain species, and I do think it's a beautiful theory that we can hope is true. And there are so many animals that abandon their young after a certain short period of nurture. But those that continue to take care of the young and maybe even go to another generation, like elephants, with matriarchs and patriarchs, you can see how that might be of great survival value.
I'm a student of many of the writings of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin,
who, that's who Medawar was tearing apart in that line about just to describe what he says is to tear it down.
There was a lot to tear down, but the interesting part was his positing that life is a complex process of simplicity becoming more complex with increasing consciousness following. And I've always loved dearly his line that out of the womb of the biosphere, human beings were vomited forth as a self-reflective conscious creature. Not that I don't believe there may be others that are somewhat reflective as well, but his theory was that the catch is if we do not catch up our consciousness with our complexity as a species, we will destroy ourselves and the world before we achieve greatness, which for him went a whole other direction.
He was a very interesting thinker, and I think he's the one, was it Desjardins or was it a counterpart of his in Russia, Vladimir Vernadsky? One of them talked about the noosphere. It was him?
Geosphere, biosphere, and then the noosphere was when human beings came.
Yeah, so the geosphere is the planet, and the biosphere is life on Earth, and then the noosphere is the sphere of mind generated by our kind, enveloping all of life. And when I read that back in the day, I was hanging around with global warming scientists back in the early 1980s when people weren't really talking about global warming yet. And I suggested that we might call our geological era the Nuocene because it's shaped by mind. And that didn't catch on. Now it's being called the Anthropocene, so because of so many anthropogenetic effects. And I have to say, I think that's a better name because what we're doing to this planet is not conscious. It's not really, we're not thinking things through. So it would be wrong to call this age the Nuocene. It's right to call it the Anthropocene.
It seems like what he was saying is humans can make anything too complicated.
Well, that's for sure. That's for sure. But Darwin was convinced that consciousness is not just a human property, that all complex adaptations can be traced back through time. And so if once we really do understand the origins of consciousness, we'll be able to trace it in much simpler animals than ourselves, which is a cool thought.
Back to the grandmother concept, not to beat a dead horse, but there is considerable evidence out there about intergenerationality in communities, in teams, create a stability and a robustness that allows that, whether it's a baseball team or whether it's a community of practice, to endure robustly. So there's quite a bit of evidence out there. And back to what he was saying, elephants are the animal species besides primates that I'm familiar with, where the older females, the matriarchs, choose the grazing lands and actually lead the herds, to migrate over the years.
There is something wonderful about groups that include many generations in a family or in a town, or it's part of the joy of being part of a university. And there is some sense of stability about that that's really, really precious.
Any other questions? Any questions from the east side of the room? They're all on the west. Oh, over here. Irene, hang on.
You referred indirectly to the economics of longevity when you said that it minimized the need for future generations. I think something like that. Is there anybody studying what happens to the economy as we live longer and longer?
There are quite a few studies of that, and you should go to the lecture of the man sitting next to you tomorrow, Jay Olshansky, who will, I'm sure, be talking about that. Fascinating issues. Also, there'll be a lecture tomorrow about the ethics of longevity. And I think that's territory that many of our questions tonight have taken us. And so I recommend that too. That's Martha
Montello.
Martha Montello. So I think we've got a very rich day ahead of us. Or maybe one more question?
There are some studies of the development of the brain, fossilized brains through time, and those brains that grew the largest are in those species that socialize, and those brains that grew the least are in those species that didn't. And I don't know if there's a connection between that and longevity in the different species.
Some people argue that it was the pressures of being social that drove the evolution of our big brains. You need to be able to read other people around you, and that's of enormous survival value, and so our brains grew and grew. And maybe there's some truth to that. But those... Well, I'd have to think about that. Let me think about that one. Come back to me tomorrow about that one. All right, thank you very, very much, everybody.
No, thank you, and have a good evening, and see you tomorrow morning.
Yes.